The election in Taiwan hadn't even begun. It hadn't even been completed. The final votes weren't even tallied before the United States, the Biden administration, decided to do the what could be considered the unthinkable, or maybe better termed, did the disastrous, which was announce something very curious, maybe shocking to some, that the Biden administration would decide to do this. So the Financial Times reports that Joe Biden is going to send a delegation to Taipei after its elections. Experts say the move could complicate recent efforts to ease tensions between Washington and Beijing. President Joe Biden plans to send a high-level delegation of former top officials to Taipei after the election in Taiwan Saturday, in a move that could complicate efforts by the U.S. and China to stabilize their strained relations. The U.S. or the White House has tapped James Steinberg, a former Democratic Deputy Secretary of State, and Stephen Halliday, a former Republican National Security Advisor, to lead a bipartisan delegation, including, according to 5 people familiar with the plans. Earlier in his administration, Biden dispatched 2 high-level delegations of former officials to Taipei to reassure Taiwan about U.S. support in the face of pressure from Beijing. But sending such a delegation immediately after a presidential election is unusual and probably will anger China. Taiwan's election pits Lai Ching-te, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party candidate, against Hu Yu-yi, the candidate from the main opposition party, the KMT, and Ko Wen-ji from the Taiwan People's Party. China is extremely wary of Lai, who is associated with the wing of the DPP that advocates Taiwan's de facto independence and formalizing it. So the U.S., the mission also comes as the U.S. and China try to stabilize ties that have been mired in the worst state since the countries normalized diplomatic relations in 1979. Biden held a summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping in San Francisco in November, at which they talked about the need to ease relations. So I don't have to go on. The point here is that tensions are at their worst point between the U.S. and China since normalization, and that what I call fake rapprochement from the United States is being exposed as exactly that. Really, the results of this election in Taiwan are not so consequential. Why is that? It's because the United States is meddling in the affairs of Taiwan. And so it has done its utmost, and it's been a concerted process to elevate the DPP and to ensure that it has, at the very least, a marginal advantage in this election, and it is likely to win. But it's important, and Bloomberg was already taking live results, and I want to show them now because I want to scroll now as people started casting their ballots. We're talking about shares of presidential votes. We're not going to really know until 4 a.m. on the 13th who exactly won. But, they did a whole map here. But I want to show you legislative election results because this is also critical. Yes, the president is one thing, but also the so-called parliament of the authority is another. And here you see the massive win by the DPP in 2016 was then counteracted by a pretty large change in the legislative council, and it's likely that the KMT will build on those gains. And so, regardless of what happens, if the DPP wins, yes, they'll have their figurehead, but the legislative council will likely change and shape up to be more KMT oriented because people are more and more fed up with this China emphasis. The DPP has done a pretty astounding job with the U.S.'s copious amounts of arms sales and other kinds of aid, especially the political maneuvering. The DPP, in many respects, is the product of its own kind of color revolution inside of Taiwan. With that kind of meddling, the DPP is likely to remain influential. But at the same time, there is a lot of sentiment against this. So you have numerous reports now that the United States is going to send a delegation. That's the big story here, regardless of what happens with the election. It seems like they know, because it's quite unlikely that the KMT would be enthusiastic about such a delegation. Remember, the KMT, it's important to understand the politics here. The KMT the Kuomintang, is the nationalist party that had once ruled for many, many decades under martial law, that was the exile party following the 1949 New China Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. That party, however, adheres to the one China principle. And why is that? Well, the KMT views itself in the final analysis as the rightful government of China, all of China, not just Taiwan. And so, where unity is between the KMT and maybe the mainland government is this understanding that while these two sides work out their differences, and really the reality of the situation kind of works out those differences for both sides, given the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, is by far more powerful, influential, legitimate than the KMT at this point. But as both sides work out their differences, they have an understanding that there's only one China, and that only a government, a political party, and a government based in China can rule over it. Meaning that the one China principle is so important because it is really about solidifying sovereignty. So that's why the KMT is not likely to accept, or at least is much less likely to accept, a delegation. So what does this mean? It likely means that the United States knows something about these elections before they've even casted ballots. But all of this shows a pretty stark hypocrisy. It exposes hypocrisy, and exposes a dangerous kind of hypocrisy, because what the Biden administration is proposing is not just a violation of the one China principle, which it, and I'm going to show you through friend of the show, Brian Berletic, uh, uh, how these governments, the United States and the collective West, actually do verbalize that they support the one China principle. But not only is this a violation, but this is a maneuver that could lead us closer to war, that could lead the world closer to war, a war between the US and China. Remember, the United States has already sent numerous delegations over the last several years to Taiwan. There was the infamous trip, August 2022, of Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan and causing such a stir that there was a belief that China might have redirected, or perhaps even attempted to apprehend the aircraft that Nancy Pelosi was taking the trip in, which was literally backed by Pentagon hardware. She was being escorted by fighter jets. That's how serious the situation was. That is how serious the United States was in provoking China toward a war. Then, of course, you had the visit between Kevin McCarthy and Tsai Ing-wen in the following year in 2023. You've had Republican delegations as well go to Taiwan. You've had basically a stamping, a trampling of the one China principle over the course, especially of the last couple of years. And so the Biden administration, though, doing this ups the ante even more, because this is the sitting president. When Nancy Pelosi decided to do what she did, decided to go to Taipei, the Biden administration, what did it say? Joe Biden said, "Not my problem. I can't control what Nancy Pelosi does." Do I agree with it? I'm not sure. Probably not. But I can't control what she does. She's acting on her own volition. What does the Biden administration have to say now that this delegation is being announced before the election results? Not only demonstrating an utter disrespect toward the very policy that you claim to adhere to, but it also foreshadows the election itself. So that's why I said the election doesn't really matter, because it appears the United States already knows who is going to win. So Brian Berletic had this to say about, it's important. What he does is he outlines the um exactly the policies ascribed to by the United Kingdom and by the United States, really by all of AUKUS, Australia, the United Kingdom, and the US, this new military alliance against China. He outlines how they all claim to support the one China principle. Here we go.
This is the British Parliament's House of Commons Library, Taiwan History, Politics, and UK Relations. This was published last year, August 2023. And it says, the People's Republic of China's One China Principle asserts that Taiwan is an integral part of China, and as part of this, that other countries must only maintain official diplomatic relations with itself. It also opposes Taiwan's participation in international organizations. Now listen to this part very carefully. The United Kingdom, like most other countries, does not recognize Taiwan as a state, nor does it maintain formal diplomatic relations with the island. It is not a country. There is no British embassy in Taiwan. Taiwan is a part of China, as per the UK's One China policy. Let's see what the United States says about this. This is from the official United States Department of State website, state.gov, U.S. relations with Taiwan. This was last updated on May 28th, 2022. And it says, the United States' approach to Taiwan has remained consistent across decades and administrations. The United States has a long-standing One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 U.S.-China joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, which is none of America's business. But the key takeaway here is we do not support Taiwan independence. Taiwan does not have independence. It is not a country. And elsewhere in this statement, they talk about the American Institute in Taiwan. That is where the U.S. government interfaces with their, to be frank, their client regime in Taipei. There is no U.S. embassy in Taiwan because Taiwan is not a country. So why would you have an embassy someplace that is not a country? The U.S. already has an embassy in China.
I mean, that's how basic it can get, right? If we look at this, you can read any mainstream media report, every single mainstream media report, the BBC, the Associated Press, Bloomberg, you can go down the line. They all say a very similar thing. What they say, what they claim is that the Taiwan Authority, the government in Taiwan, is a de facto independent government, or they say that it has its own political system. It is already separate. Some have said, I read Foreign Affairs, it's a separate place already, basically indicating that they support Taiwan independence, but they won't go so far as to proclaim independence. This is a very delicate propaganda game that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is trying to wage
elsewhere in China. While we're looking at the UK and the US, we might as well look at Australia. The in AUKUS, this is the Australian government, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia-Taiwan relationship. AUKUS being a specifically anti-China bloc made up of the US, UK, and Australia. And a key part of this is their claim that they need to help defend Taiwan from China. But what does the Australian government actually say about Taiwan and its status? It says, the terms of our joint communique dictate the fundamental basis of Australia's One China policy. The Australian government does not recognize the Republic of China. That is what the government in Taipei officially calls itself, the Republic of China, because even in Taipei, they recognize Taiwan as part of China. They just see themselves as the sole legitimate government of all of China, which I think we could all agree is utterly absurd. It says the Australian government does not recognize the Republic of China as the sovereign state and does not regard the authorities in Taiwan as having the status of a national government. So very clear. The UK, the US, Australia, all 3 members of AUKUS recognize Taiwan as part of China officially. Unofficially, they encourage independence, and they're maneuvering Taiwan into the middle of a conflict between the US and its allies and China, the rest of China.
So that's the reality. The reality is that the United States, its allies, or we could call them vassals at this point, they all say the same thing. Because look, there are very few governments left in the world that don't acknowledge the People's Republic of China as the rightful government of all of China, including Taiwan. The collective West as a whole is in that camp. And they, on the one hand, claim that they're for the one China principle, they adhere to it, they don't support Taiwan independence. And on the other hand, they hype an election, a presidential election in the Taiwan province within its authority as some kind of possible game changer or not a game changer. The point is that there's a debate and that every single report that you read about it all says that uh, uh, Taiwan is de facto independent, is a separate place, is claimed to be part of China. There's a ruse here. Read the New York Times, read the BBC, read Bloomberg, read all of them. They all say a very similar thing, and they all paint a picture of aggression. But the real aggression is what the Biden administration is about to do. The Biden administration is about to send a delegation to Taiwan after an election. What does that say? What does the United States, what do most sovereign countries do with especially deep relations, right? China and Russia, for example, after an election or a transition of power in China or Russia over the last several years, the heads of state of either China or Russia will visit each other after the fact. So we can maybe expect Xi Jinping to go to Russia after Vladimir Putin most likely wins the election this coming year. This has been a regular occurrence between China and Russia for quite some time. That is pretty standard practice, especially for bigger countries with influence. The United States is sending a message, but the Biden administration in particular is sending a message that it is treating Taiwan as a separate country, that its elections are not just legitimate, but a reflection of a political status that doesn't even exist, not in the slightest. So, this is a dangerous maneuver. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised one bit because the United States is now finding itself being dragged on literally just so many fronts. It's hard to count at this point. Um, Sharmi Nawani, she wrote this in response, and I think it's really relevant here. She wrote this. Sharmi Nawani, she is one of the editors over at the great outlet The Cradle. She wrote this tweet, and I want to read it because while it references Yemen, she says, I honestly question whether the US or UK have carefully considered Yemen's potential responses to this act of war. Ansar Allah is an unusual member of the region's axis of resistance. It marches to its own tune. Its own mindset is entirely devoid of Western narrative grooming. There's no guessing at the full spectrum of its retaliatory palette, but I would not want to be an American or Brit in the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, or any of the neighboring waterways right now. It may be that Washington misread the Russian and Chinese abstentions at the UNSC yesterday, or perhaps Moscow and Beijing dangled that bait so the US would miscalculate this badly. The Americans are now, this is the big point, are bogged down, engaged in supplying 5 separate fronts: Ukraine, Gaza, Israel, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. U.S. adversaries can easily hold out until fatigue sets in. They are nowhere near depleted. Bottom line, I think the entire global south is going to be wearing Abdul Malik al-Houthi shirts by springtime. So while that's a very favorable account of Yemen's situation, the point here is that Taiwan is one of these fronts. China is one of these fronts the United States is bogged down in, and yet the Biden administration wants to bog itself down even more after this election, rather than do what has been done over the last 6 months, which is move into a position with China in terms of optics, which sends the message to the global public opinion that perhaps things are thawing to a degree. There will be some more stability, so we won't see a hot war anytime soon. Those kind of optics are now rapidly shifting. And I predicted this. This election in Taiwan comes at a very interesting moment where the Biden administration finds itself not a year out from its own election season itself. There is an election coming up in November, and Joe Biden doesn't look too good. The current administration doesn't look too good. So it's quite plausible, actually, it's almost a guarantee that the Biden administration will have to pivot to a harder stance on China. But how can it? This is the moment that I think, or this is another example of a moment that is unprecedented in character, where the United States is so bogged down that we can't even really predict how it's going to uh, intensify or escalate an aggressive posture toward a country in a position like China, a rising power, if not the superpower in the world right now. I wouldn't call itself a superpower, but China is really the most influential country in the world at this moment, and that's a fact. So, how can the United States get deeper and deeper into conflict with China when it has to face the escalating situation in West Asia, which includes the axis of resistance, Yemen and Nasrallah, Hezbollah, um, the resistance in Iraq and Syria, all these forces create wreaking havoc on the stability of a U.S. and Israeli influence and domination there. How can it when Ukraine is in this decline, in this decrepit state, when Ukraine is really caught in a spiral of defeat? How can it truly, how can the United States truly escalate with China? Well, the Biden administration is telling us we're going to find out. We're going to find out how that is going to be the case, because should this delegation happen, we can expect a response from China, a very similar one to how they've responded already. We're going to see likely condemnations, yes, but we'll also probably see increased military drills around the island of Taiwan in an attempt to show the United States that any escalation toward a conflict, it's really a reminder, any escalation toward a conflict on this issue, any attempt to push independence for Taiwan will be met with war. China doesn't want a war. I've been saying this for quite some time. China does not want a war over Taiwan. No, it doesn't. It wants peaceful reunification. It's very clear on this. The country that has followed the one China principle out of, if we look at China, the United States, its Western vassals, the one that has followed the one China principle in terms of to its letter is China. And so China has given us no reason to suspect that it's going to quote unquote invade Taiwan, as we're constantly told. But it is building up the capacity where, if it does need to respond to the United States, if it does need to intervene, that it can, that it certainly could. All of the war game simulations from CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, I went over it on this program, Rand Corporation, they all say this is not going to go well for anybody, but the United States is going to be one of those that suffers quite significantly. And so China is building up a capacity to be able to enact that suffering should it need to occur. But unlike the United States, which literally will bomb Yemen whenever times get rough, whenever there's a need to protect its interests abroad, despite those interests being illegitimate, China is not going to take the bait. What China will do is it will prepare and it will show, it will stage what can happen. And given the fact that in this coming election in the United States between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, there will be no friends of China per se, given the fact that it's highly likely that both will need to use the China card to curry political favor with those forces that want to see war with China, or that simply, maybe irrationally, just hate China because they see China as the principal and foremost rival to American hegemony, to really the American way of life. It's likely that both of these candidates are going to need to step up their anti-China rhetoric. And what better way to do that than provoke China into having to show the United States that Taiwan will not just be protected, but really Chinese sovereignty will be protected, and China will react, will respond, and will prepare for war if it has to go to war. There's no better moment than this. And so I believe the Biden administration is really paving the way for a domestic political campaign where it can say, oh, yeah, we sent this delegation. Taiwan's election went with a hitch, without a hitch. And look, China cannot take democracy. It can't handle it. And so look at all these military operations, drills that it conducted after we did this. It's obvious that we need to get tougher on China. The U.S. foreign policy establishment is trying to push us further into a war that will not bring any kind of victory, not to the United States, not even to China, because a war over Taiwan is going to go nuclear. These are the conclusions that the United States is drawing, and I think it begs the question then, as we are witnessing this unprecedented moment of U.S. decline, it begs the question as to, well, what really is the future of U.S. influence in this region and around the world? The future is that it has no future. And that is something that we should not run away from. We shouldn't cry about. We shouldn't feel any kind of remorse over. We should be preparing for the moment where the United States, and this is what uh, um, uh, many people in China have told me when I visited, is that the United States should be preparing for the day when it is just another country. Yang Jiemian, I met him. Who is this? He is the brother of Yang Jiechi, the former foreign minister of China and top diplomat of China before Wang Yi took the helm. You might remember him from the infamous summit at Anchorage, Alaska, where Antony Blinken essentially got dragged and his clock cleaned in a humiliating, absolutely humiliating and aggressive posture of the United States being exposed to the world. I met his brother when I was in China last, and his brother told me in the delegation that the United States must prepare for the moment when it is just another country. Meddling in the affairs of Taiwan does not help this fact one bit. Because what the US is trying to do here is it's trying to create a scenario that will never come to pass. Taiwan may act like and may be treated like the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the United States to thwart China's rise. But really, in the final analysis, the only thing the United States has to look forward to in this regard is failure. Failure to contain China's rise, a failure to remain relevant in the region, and a failure in its overall attempt to maintain and expand on its fledgling and increasingly illegitimate hegemony. That is all that it can look forward to, and you better believe that the United States will go to war over this. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHypocrisy. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.